Introduction in 6th century BC. The ancient city of Miletus became the birthplace of something extraordinary, something that would change the way humanity viewed the world forever. It was here, on the shores of Ionia, that the first sparks of philosophy ignited. Forget the gods pulling strings behind the scenes. The thinkers of Miletus started looking to the stars, the sea, and the earth for answers. What if the world wasn't governed by divine whims, but by something simpler, something natural? In the bustling streets of Miletus, philosophers like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes dared to ask, what is everything made of? How does the universe really work? Their curiosity sparked a revolution that paved the way for Western philosophy and science as we know it. These men weren't just asking big questions. They were laying down the building blocks of rational thought. As we delve into their world, consider how these early visionaries set the stage for a new way of thinking that echoes across millennia. How did their ideas challenge the status quo? And why do their thoughts still matter today? Hold on tight as we dive into Miletus, a city that wasn't just ahead of its time, but helped define time itself. Historical context of Miletus. Miletus wasn't just another Greek city-state. It was a hub of trade, culture, and, most importantly, ideas. Located on the western coast of what is now Turkey, Miletus had access to both land and sea routes, allowing it to thrive economically. This prosperity attracted merchants, travelers, and thankfully for history, philosophers. The city's strategic position as a trading port didn't just bring goods from faraway lands, it brought new ideas. Miletus was a melting pot, where local thinkers could exchange thoughts with travelers from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and beyond. In this vibrant intellectual atmosphere, philosophy found fertile ground. Politically, Miletus was relatively independent. As a member of the Ionian League, it enjoyed enough autonomy to foster free thought, free from the more rigid structures of mainland Greece. This freedom allowed its thinkers to explore radical ideas about the universe, leading to the emergence of the first philosophers. But why was Miletus different from other Greek cities? Its wealth not only built impressive architecture but also funded education and the arts. This combination of economic success, geographical advantage, and intellectual curiosity set the stage for a philosophical revolution. The wealthy elite had time to ponder life's big questions, and they were about to come up with answers that would shake the foundations of myth and tradition. In this context, the thinkers of Miletus were ready to challenge old beliefs, proposing that the universe could be explained not by divine intervention, but by natural laws and fundamental substances. As we will see, the legacy of Miletus wasn't just intellectual. It was the dawn of a new way of thinking that would forever change the world. The Pre-Socratics before Socrates came along and made everyone question everything. There were the Pre-Socratics, the first philosophers to ditch mythology in favor of reason and observation. These early thinkers weren't satisfied with the traditional stories of gods controlling every aspect of life. Instead, they sought to understand the universe in a more systematic and natural way. The pre-Socratic philosophers from Miletus, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes are often considered the pioneers of this shift. They didn't always agree on what the fundamental substance of the universe was, but they shared a common goal: to figure out how the world worked based on reason, not myth. Thales thought everything came from water. Anaximander argued for the infinite or Apeiron, and Anaximenes, he went for air as the ultimate building block of the cosmos. What makes these early thinkers remarkable is that they introduced the idea of searching for natural explanations. They planted the seeds of rational inquiry that later bloomed into scientific thought. So, while their ideas about what the world was made of might seem quaint now, their approach laid the groundwork for centuries of philosophical and scientific development. Let's dive deeper into the ideas of these trailblazers who turned their eyes from Mount Olympus to the natural world around them. Thales of Miletus, often called the father of Western philosophy, was the guy who looked at the world and thought, maybe it's simpler than we think. Forget all those gods stirring up storms or shaking the earth. For Thales, there had to be a fundamental principle, something natural behind everything. His bold proposition? Water was the essence of all things. Why water? Well, Thales lived in a coastal city, surrounded by water, which played a critical role in life from the sea to the rain. Water could transform into different forms, solid, liquid, and vapor, so it made sense to him that it was the source of all things. It was, at least, a much simpler and more observable explanation than gods hurling lightning bolts. But Thales wasn't just sitting around thinking big thoughts. He was a practical guy. He's credited with predicting a solar eclipse in 585 BC and, according to legend, even demonstrated basic geometry by measuring the height of a pyramid using its shadow. Thales didn't just lay down abstract theories. He applied his ideas to real-world problems. This blend of philosophy, science, and practical reasoning was revolutionary for its time. His legacy wasn't just in suggesting that water was the root of all things. More importantly, Thales asked the question that would fuel centuries of inquiry. What is the fundamental substance of the universe? And for the first time in Western thought, the answer didn't involve divine forces. It involved observation, logic, and reasoning. He was shifting the discussion from myth to method. In short, Thales kickstarted a movement where humans could look at the natural world, ask why things worked the way they did, and use their minds rather than myths to explain it. His idea might not sound like much now, but without it, philosophy and science as we know them might never have begun. Anaximander and the Apeiron Anaximander, a student of Thales, wasn't entirely convinced that water was the ultimate substance behind everything. He looked at the vastness of the cosmos and thought, there has to be something bigger, something beyond the elements we can see and touch. So, he proposed a radical new idea, the Apeiron, or the infinite. For Anaximander, the Apeiron wasn't water, air, or fire. It was something limitless and undefined, a boundless, eternal source that gives rise to everything in the universe. He believed that all things come from this infinite substance and eventually return to it. The Apeiron, according to Anaximander, is what drives the cycles of birth, life, death, and rebirth in the cosmos. In other words, the universe is like a giant recycling program, with the Apeiron as its endless source of energy and matter. One of his key contributions was the idea that nature operates according to laws, not whims of the gods. Anaximander suggested that natural phenomena, like the changing seasons or the movement of the stars, were the result of underlying rules rather than divine interventions. It was a bold step towards understanding the universe as a system governed by principles, rather than supernatural forces. Interestingly, Anaximander was also something of a proto-scientist. He created one of the earliest known maps of the world and attempted to explain the origins of life. He theorized that humans evolved from fish-like creatures long before Darwin came on the scene with his theory of evolution. While Anaximander's version of evolution might not hold up in a biology textbook today, his willingness to challenge traditional views and explore new ideas was groundbreaking. What made Anaximander's concept of the Apeiron so important wasn't just the idea itself, but what it represented, a move towards abstraction in philosophy. He opened the door to thinking about the universe in terms of unseen forces and principles, which would later influence both metaphysics and science. Instead of focusing on a tangible substance like water, Anaximander embraced the idea that the universe could be explained by something beyond the physical, something limitless. Anaximenes and the theory of air, following in the intellectual footsteps of Thales and Anaximander. Anaximenes wasn't about to settle for the infinite, abstract Apeiron. He looked at his teacher Anaximander's theory and thought, sure, the Apeiron is a fascinating idea, but let's keep things a bit more tangible. So, Anaximenes proposed a new contender for the fundamental substance of the universe, air. Air, according to Anaximenes, was not just the stuff we breathe, it was the very essence of all matter. He argued that everything in the universe, from rocks to clouds to living beings, was made from air in various forms. He took a more practical, observable approach to explaining how the world works. Through processes of rarefaction thinning and condensation thickening, air could transform into different substances. When air rarefies, it becomes fire. When it condenses, it can turn into wind, then clouds, water, earth, and, eventually, stone. Think about it like this. Anaximenes viewed air as a kind of cosmic Swiss Army knife. It could shift and change into anything depending on its density. This explanation was not only elegant, but also rooted in observation. You can imagine him feeling the wind on his face and watching the way mist turns into rain, thinking, yep, this air is the key to understanding the universe. Anaximenes' theory might sound a bit simplistic today, but it was a significant leap forward at the time. His focus on natural processes such as rarefaction and condensation highlighted his commitment to explaining the world through observable phenomena, not mystical forces. This approach was crucial in moving philosophy further toward the scientific method, where observation and rational analysis take center stage. One of the most interesting aspects of Anaximenes' theory is that he maintained the unity of the cosmos by suggesting that everything comes from one fundamental substance, just like Thales and Anaximander. But unlike his predecessors, Anaximenes offered a more dynamic process for how the world changes. Air wasn't static, it was constantly in motion, transforming and shaping the material world. Anaximenes also applied his air theory to the cosmos, suggesting that the Earth floats on a cushion of air, and that the stars, the sun, and the moon are also held in place by it. He saw air as the substance that not only made up the material world, but also sustained the order of the universe. While this might seem like a giant leap today, in his time, it was an attempt to explain the world without relying on divine intervention. Where Anaximenes shines is in his attempt to simplify and unify the understanding of the cosmos. By proposing a tangible, observable substance as the foundation of everything, he grounded early philosophy in something people could see and experience, bridging the gap between abstract thought and physical reality. His approach was scientific in spirit, making him a crucial link in the transition from myth to reason in Western thought. In the grand scheme of things, Anaximenes continued the Milesian tradition of pushing the boundaries of knowledge, asking daring questions, and trying to explain the universe in naturalistic terms. He didn't just look at the world, he breathed it in and exhaled philosophy. Transition from mythology to philosophy. The shift from mythology to philosophy was one of the most profound changes in the intellectual history of ancient Greece, and it began right here in Miletus. Before thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes came onto the scene, the Greeks relied heavily on mythology to explain the world around them. Earthquakes, that was Poseidon having a bad day. Thunderstorms, obviously, Zeus was upset about something. Everything was attributed to the gods and their often unpredictable moods. But the Milesian philosophers took a daring step away from these divine explanations. Instead of attributing natural phenomena to the whims of the gods, they asked a radical question: what if the world operates on its own, governed by natural forces and principles? They didn't deny the existence of the gods, but they shifted the focus from mythology to a search for natural explanations. This shift was nothing short of revolutionary. For centuries, mythology had provided all the answers people thought they needed. But the philosophers of Miletus, observing the world with curiosity, began to challenge this framework. They were no longer satisfied with stories of gods throwing lightning bolts or controlling the seas. They wanted reason, logic, and evidence. For example, instead of assuming the changing seasons were a result of divine temperaments, they looked for physical causes. Anaximander, with his Apeiron, saw the cosmos as an eternal cycle governed by natural laws. Thales and Anaximenes sought single substances, water and air, respectively, that could explain the variety and complexity of the world. These ideas didn't come from divine inspiration, but from observation and logical deduction. This was the true breakthrough of the Milesian school. They introduced the notion that the universe could be understood through inquiry, observation, and rational thought. By proposing natural principles to explain the world's workings, they laid the groundwork for both science and philosophy as disciplines. This transition wasn't just about finding a different explanation for phenomena, it was about changing the very way humans approach knowledge. Imagine how radical this was at the time. Here were thinkers suggesting that everything from the stars in the sky to the fish in the sea could be explained without invoking the gods. They were essentially asking people to step back from millennia of tradition and see the world in a new light, one where human reason could unlock the secrets of the cosmos. It's worth noting that this shift didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without resistance. Mythology wasn't just a way to explain natural events. It was deeply embedded in the social, religious, and cultural fabric of Greek life. But the Milesian philosophers laid the first bricks of a path that others, like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, would eventually walk, expanding on these early ideas and developing entire systems of thought based on reason and inquiry. In short, the transition from mythology to philosophy was a game changer, and Miletus was ground zero. By turning their gaze away from Olympus and towards the natural world, these early thinkers sparked a revolution in thought that would echo through the centuries. Influence on science and mathematics. The philosophers of Miletus didn't just revolutionize the way people thought about the cosmos, they laid the groundwork for advancements in science and mathematics that would shape the future of human knowledge. Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes weren't simply asking abstract questions about the universe. They were also applying their reasoning to solve practical problems and explore the natural world in ways that would later influence the scientific method. Let's start with Thales. He wasn't just a philosopher. He was also an early mathematician and astronomer. His most famous contribution to mathematics was his work with geometry. According to historical accounts, Thales traveled to Egypt, where he learned about the geometric techniques used by the Egyptians to measure land and construct buildings. Upon his return to Miletus, he adapted these ideas and made some key discoveries of his own. He's credited with establishing Thales' theorem, which explains the properties of triangles, particularly how angles work in circles. And let's not forget the story of him using geometry to measure the height of the Great Pyramid by comparing its shadow to the length of his own. In addition to his contributions to geometry, Thales was known for his astronomical observations. He famously predicted a solar eclipse in 585 BC, a feat that would have seemed almost magical at the time. But it wasn't magic, it was the application of observation and prediction, the first steps toward what we now recognize as scientific reasoning. He showed that the movements of celestial bodies could be studied, predicted, and explained through rational means, rather than being attributed to the unpredictable behavior of the gods. Now let's look at Anaximander. His contributions to science were even more forward-thinking, particularly in the fields of astronomy and cosmology. Anaximander was the first to propose that the Earth floats freely in space, without anything supporting it, a radical idea in a time when many believed the earth rested on the back of a giant turtle or was held up by divine intervention. He also theorized that the celestial bodies made complete circles around the earth, a concept that laid the foundation for future models of the cosmos. But perhaps the most forward-looking aspect of Anaximander's thinking was his ideas about evolution. While not exactly Darwinian, Anaximander speculated that life began in water and that humans might have evolved from aquatic creatures. Though his ideas were based more on speculation than evidence, they still reflect an astonishing leap in thinking, moving from divine creation myths to a naturalistic understanding of how life might have developed. Anaximenes may have focused on air as the fundamental substance, but his influence also extended into the scientific realm. His theory of rarefaction and condensation, the idea that air, when compressed, becomes solid and when expanded, becomes fire, was an early attempt to explain natural transformations through observable processes. Anaximenes' approach suggested that natural changes could be explained by physical laws rather than mystical forces, marking a critical step toward a scientific understanding of matter and its properties. Beyond their individual contributions, these thinkers from Miletus shared a common trait: they applied their philosophical inquiries to practical problems. They didn't just speculate about the universe, they observed, measured, and hypothesized based on what they could see, touch, and experience. This approach would become the foundation for what we now know as the scientific method. Their influence on mathematics and science can't be overstated. By asking big questions and using logic and observation to answer them, the Milesian philosophers helped shift the mindset from myth to method. Their willingness to challenge traditional beliefs and seek rational explanations for the world around them paved the way for future scientific exploration. The likes of Pythagoras, Euclid, and Aristotle all benefited from the intellectual groundwork laid by these early pioneers. In essence, the thinkers of Miletus were not just philosophers, they were the first scientists. Their use of reason, observation, and mathematics as tools to understand the natural world set them apart from their predecessors and created a legacy that would endure through the ages. Philosophical legacy: the intellectual ripple effect of the thinkers from Miletus extended far beyond their lifetimes, setting the stage for some of the greatest philosophical minds in history: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, to pick up where they left off. While Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes may not have had the polished systems of thought that later philosophers developed, their pioneering efforts to understand the world through reason and observation rather than myth left a profound mark on the trajectory of Western philosophy. At the heart of their legacy is the idea that the universe is not governed by arbitrary divine forces but by consistent, understandable principles. The Milesians weren't just suggesting new theories about water, air, or the infinite. They were proposing a completely new way of thinking. This focus on natural laws and logical reasoning was a direct precursor to natural philosophy, which would evolve into modern science. It also opened the door to metaphysical inquiry. What is reality made of? What are the fundamental principles that govern existence? Fast forward to Socrates, the man who made why the most powerful question in history. While Socrates himself didn't concern himself with cosmology or physics the way the Milesians did, he inherited their spirit of inquiry. His method of persistent questioning, now known as the Socratic method, reflects the same drive to seek truth through reason, dialogue, and critical thinking. By focusing on ethics and the nature of knowledge, Socrates shifted philosophy's focus from the physical world to the moral and intellectual realms. However, the idea that knowledge could be pursued through reason and dialogue, rather than revelation or myth, was something he owed to the early pioneers in Miletus. Then we have Plato, who took these ideas to the next level. Plato's philosophy was deeply influenced by the concept of underlying principles that govern reality, an idea that traces back to the Milesian search for a single, unifying substance or force. Plato's theory of forms, for example, suggests that the physical world is just a shadow of a higher, more perfect reality and abstract world of ideals. This idea of an unseen, eternal principle governing the universe resonates with Anaximander's Apeiron, the limitless source from which all things arise and return. Though Plato took it in a different direction, the underlying intellectual framework had its roots in Miletus. And finally, Aristotle, perhaps the most direct intellectual descendant of the Milesians, carried their torch in his own investigations of the natural world. Aristotle was both a philosopher and a scientist, and his work in biology, physics, and ethics reflected the same spirit of empirical observation and rational analysis that the Milesians had championed. His idea of the four elements earth, water, air, and fire echoes the Milesian search for a fundamental substance. But Aristotle went further by systematizing and categorizing knowledge, laying the foundation for centuries of scientific thought. The philosophical legacy of Miletus can also be traced through later schools of thought, such as Stoicism and Epicureanism, which continue to explore the nature of the universe, human existence, and the role of reason in understanding both. The Stoics, in particular, were interested in the concept of natural law governing both the cosmos and human behavior, an idea that can be traced back to the early inquiries of the Milesians. But the impact of Miletus didn't stop in antiquity. The way we think about the universe today through scientific inquiry, theories, and laws of nature is a direct continuation of the questions the Milesians first posed. Their focus on natural explanations for natural phenomena was the first step in what would eventually become the scientific method. Their inquiries were picked up and expanded by thinkers during the Renaissance, such as Galileo, Newton, and Descartes, who all stood on the shoulders of these early giants from Miletus. Moreover, the concept of a universe governed by rational principles influenced the development of modern philosophy. Immanuel Kant, for instance, in his critique of pure reason, wrestled with the idea of how we come to understand the world, echoing the same struggle the Milesians faced when they first abandoned myth for method. Even modern physicists like Stephen Hawking and Albert Einstein have followed the intellectual trail blazed by these early thinkers, searching for unified laws that can explain everything from the smallest particle to the vastness of the cosmos. So, while Miletus may seem like a small, ancient city, its contributions to human thought are anything but small. The city's philosophers laid the foundations for centuries of inquiry, not just in philosophy, but in science, ethics, and logic. Their quest to understand the universe through reason continues to shape the way we think today, making their legacy one of the most enduring in human history. The scientific method. As we draw the curtain on the intellectual legacy of Miletus, it's clear that the seeds planted by Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes would grow into something far greater than even they could have imagined. These early philosophers, through their relentless questioning of the natural world, set in motion the development of the scientific method, a systematic approach to inquiry that remains the bedrock of modern science. What makes the contributions of the Milesian thinkers so remarkable is their insistence on finding natural explanations for natural phenomena. They didn't simply accept the world as it was told to them. Instead, they sought to observe, theorize, and, to the best of their abilities, test their ideas. Thales, with his geometric insights, and Anaximenes, with his observations on air and condensation, were both early examples of philosophers who were not content to rely on myths or inherited wisdom. They laid the foundations for the use of reason and evidence as tools to unlock the mysteries of the universe. This approach evolved into the core principles of the scientific method: observation, hypothesis, experimentation, and conclusion. While the Milesians didn't formalize this process as we understand it today, their influence is unmistakable. Their insistence on rational thought over divine explanations, their search for universal principles, and their use of empirical observation to support their ideas set a precedent that would inspire generations of thinkers from the Greek philosophers who followed, to Renaissance scientists like Galileo, to modern physicists like Einstein. It's easy to take for granted the way we now understand the world, but the fact that we rely on systematic inquiry and testable hypothesis can be traced back to the intellectual curiosity of these early pioneers. The questions they asked: what is the universe made of? How does nature work? Can we understand the cosmos through reason? Are the same questions that drive scientists today. And it all started in a bustling coastal city in Ionia, where a few curious minds dared to think differently. In the end, the legacy of Miletus is not just one of philosophy, but of human curiosity itself. These early thinkers remind us that progress begins when we stop accepting the world as it is and start asking why. They challenge the status quo, not just to defy the gods, but to search for deeper truths that are still unfolding today as we continue to explore the mysteries of the universe. So, as we reflect on the journey from mythology to reason, from speculation to science, we see that the spirit of Miletus is still very much alive. It lives on in every laboratory, every classroom, and every mind that dares to question, seek, and discover. The philosophers of Miletus didn't just change how we understand the world. They changed the very way we think about thinking. And that, perhaps, is their greatest gift to humanity.
By my side, intense, strong, no fear to face, nowhere to hide, intense. I subscribe to this channel, click like today, because content like this just lights my way, intense and slow.